In a galaxy fractured by silence and betrayal, one mother dares to defy fate. Stranded on a strange world with nothing but her child and a heart full of scars, she will either fall or find something worth living for. Rania stared at the cracked viewport of her aging spacecraft, her hands trembling as she gripped the console. The stars beyond were stark and indifferent, their cold light reflecting her own despair. Each glimmer of light seemed a silent witness to her spiraling life, a vast, uncaring cosmos that offered neither solace nor solution. Behind her, a soft, curious voice broke the silence. "Mommy, are we almost there?" Lena's small fingers tugged at Rania's sleeve, her wide, luminescent eyes filled with both wonder and exhaustion. Rania turned to her daughter, her expression softening despite the storm raging inside her. Lena's innocence was a sharp contrast to the desolation Rania felt. "Soon, my love," she whispered, her voice firm but kind. Nova Terra is just ahead. The journey to this point had been grueling. Rania's home planet, Nitharian, was a place of pristine architecture, technological marvels, and unyielding social rules. Every facet of life was dictated by rigid tradition. Families were sacred, their unity a reflection of one's honor and standing in society. To live outside that system was to exist on the fringes, a life of isolation and disdain. Once, Rania had lived in the center of that structure, cherished and admired as the wife of Dren, a man whose ambition was as vast as the galaxy itself. He had been charming, daring, and visionary, a rising star in Nitharian's ranks. Rania had loved him deeply, their bond seemingly unbreakable. They had talked for hours about their dreams, their plans to explore distant worlds, and the legacy they would leave for their child. But dreams had a way of twisting into nightmares. Dren's ambition consumed him. It began as a quest for knowledge and adventure spiraled into greed. He delved into dangerous trade routes dealing with unsavory forces that promised riches and power. Rania had pleaded with him to stop, to think of Alira, but he was deaf to her words. One rotation without warning, he left. At first, Rania waited. She believed he would return, that the man she loved would remember his promises and his family. These turned into cycles, cycles into orbits. The truth sank in slowly, like a cold fog creeping over her heart. Dren was not coming back. His absence was not just an emotional wound, it became a societal scar. On Nitharian, single mothers were viewed as failures, women who could not maintain their family's unity. They were whispered about in public spaces, their children pitied or outright shunned. Rania's once bright life dimmed under the weight of judgment and ostracism. Only Alira's voice pulled Rania back to the present. The child's face was pale, her cheeks hollow from days of meager rations. Rania bit her lip, guilt and determination warring within her. She knelt, brushing a stray strand of golden hair from Alira's face. "You're so brave, my little star," she murmured, pressing a kiss to Alira's forehead. "Just a little longer." The ship's systems groaned, a harsh reminder of its deteriorating state. Rania glanced at the navigation panel. Nova Terra's atmosphere was close, its blue and green hues vivid against the void. A sliver of hope pierced her despair. This planet, according to the scant information she had managed to gather, was said to be home to a compassionate species. Humans, they were called. Perhaps they would offer what Nitharian had refused, a chance for her and Alira to rebuild their lives. The descent was chaotic. Humans blared as the ship's aging systems struggled to handle the atmospheric entry. Rania gritted her teeth, her hands dancing over the controls as she fought to keep the craft stable. Alira clung to her arm, her small body trembling. "It's okay, Alira. I've got you," Rania said, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. The ship shuddered violently, a deafening crack splitting through the cabin as a panel burst into sparks. Smoke filled the air, stinging Rania's eyes. She activated the emergency landing protocols, praying the ship wouldn't disintegrate before they touched down. Finally, with a bone-jarring crash, the spacecraft skidded to a halt. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Rania sat frozen for a moment, her ears ringing and her heart pounding. Mummy Alira's small voice broke the stillness. Rania unbuckled herself, stumbling over to her daughter. She examined Alira for injuries, her hands shaking. "Are you hurt?" Alira shook her head, her eyes wide but calm. "I'm okay." Relief washed over Rania, and she pulled Alira into a fierce hug. "Good girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The planet's surface was a stark contrast to Netherian's sleek, floating crystal spires. Nova Terra's landscape was raw, and unpolished trees swayed in the stormy wind, their branches clawing at the dark sky. Rain poured in sheets, soaking Rania as she carried Alira out of the wreckage. She scouted the area quickly, her eyes scanning for threats. The environment was unfamiliar, its scents and sounds alien to her, but there was no time to dwell on her unease. Alira needed shelter. Using pieces of the ship's debris, Rania constructed a crude lean-to beneath the shadow of a large oak tree. The rain dripped through cracks, but it offered some protection from the relentless downpour. Rania wrapped Alira in a thermal cloak, sitting close to shield her from the cold. As the storm raged around them, Rania's mind churned with worry. She had no resources, no allies, and no idea how the inhabitants of this planet would react to her presence. But as she gazed at Alira's peaceful face, her resolve hardened. She had not come this far to fail now. For hours, Rania kept watch, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness for signs of danger. The storm began to subside. The rain softened into a steady pattern. Exhaustion pulled at her, but she refused to sleep. She couldn't risk it. Just as dawn began to break, painting the sky with pale streaks of gold, Rania's ears caught a sound of rustling in the nearby brush. Her heart leapt into her throat. She tightened her grip on a jagged piece of metal she had salvaged from the ship, ready to defend her daughter at any cost. A figure emerged from the mist, tall and broad-shouldered, with cautious movements that spoke of both curiosity and wariness. Rania's breath hitched. This was no Oriathian. It was a human. For the first time since leaving Netherian, emotion stirred within Rania, the delicate stirrings of hope and fear. Kael trudged through the muddy field, his boots sinking with each step. The storm had turned his usually tranquil farm into a mire of chaos. Fences had collapsed under the weight of the wind, and a few loose tools lay scattered across the sodden ground. He muttered a quiet curse under his breath, pulling his coat tighter against the rain that still drizzled from the gray sky. It was supposed to be a quiet dusk time, a simple check of the property line before turning in for the eclipse. But the faint glow in the distance had caught his eye. At first he dismissed it as a trick of the storm, maybe a stray bolt of lightning. Yet the light didn't flicker or fade. It pulsed, steady and faint, like a beacon. Curiosity tugged at him, and despite his exhaustion, Kael followed the light. Rania tightened her grip on the jagged metal shard, her eyes fixed on the figure approaching through the mist. Her muscles were taut, ready to spring into action if this human, This towering, broad-shouldered being posed a threat. The man stopped several feet away, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He stood still for a moment, as if assessing the situation. Then, slowly, he raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Hey there," he said, his voice deep and cautious but devoid of hostility. "Didn't mean to startle you." Rania didn't lower her makeshift weapon. The language he spoke was strange but familiar, something she had studied in preparation for her journey to Nova Terra. The words felt clumsy in her mouth, but she forced herself to respond. "Stay back," she said, her voice sharp, despite the trembling in her hands. The man nodded, taking a deliberate step back. "All right." No harm meant. His gaze flicked to the small figure curled against her. Alira peeked out from under the thermal cloak, her luminous eyes wide with curiosity. The man's brow furrowed in confusion, but there was no mistaking the concern that flickered across his face. "You too, look, like you've been through hell," he said after a moment. "You're soaked to the bone. Got a warm house just a little ways up, food, dry clothes. You can rest there if you want." Rania hesitated. The offer sounded genuine, but her trust had been shattered too many times to accept kindness without question. She glanced at Alira, whose small frame shivered despite the thermal cloak wrapped around her. The decision wasn't about her. It was about Alira. Always Alira. "Fine," she said finally, her tone clipped. "But if you try anything—" "I won't," Kale interrupted gently. "You have my word." Kyle led them back to his eco-dwelling, his steps careful as he navigated the uneven ground. Rania kept close behind him, her grip on the metal shard never loosening. Alira clung to her mother's side, her small feet slipping in the mud as they walked. When the eco-dwelling came into view, Rania's sharp gaze took in every detail. It was a modest structure, its wooden exterior weathered but sturdy. A soft yellow light glowed from the windows, casting a welcoming aura against the dreary landscape. Kyle pushed open the door and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter first. Rania hesitated, scanning the interior before stepping cautiously over the threshold. The warmth of the room enveloped her, a stark contrast to the cold rain outside. The space was simple, yet inviting. A plasma hearth crackled in one corner, its warmth seeping into the air. A worn but comfortable-looking hover lounge sat near the hearth, and a wooden table occupied the center of the room. The scent of Nova Terra and pine lingered faintly, mixed with the aroma of bread cooling on the counter. "You can sit," Kyle said, nodding toward the hover lounge. "I'll get some towels." Rania didn't move. Instead, she watched him closely as he disappeared into another room, her instincts on high alert. Alira, however, wandered toward the hover lounge, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. "Mommy, it's warm here," Alira whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Rania's chest tightened. She knelt beside her daughter, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "Stay close to me," she murmured. "Always close." Kyle returned moments later, a pair of towels draped over his arm. He handed one to Rania and placed the other on the hover lounge for Alira. "Fire's warm. You're welcome to dry off," he said, stepping back to give them space. Rania accepted the towel but didn't let her guard down. She dried Alira first, wrapping her daughter tightly in the dry cloth before tending to herself. Her movements were quick, efficient, every motion driven by the instinct to protect and provide. As the dusk time wore on, Kale busied himself in the kitchen, giving Rania and Alira time to acclimate. He moved with a quiet purpose, gathering supplies and setting a pot on the stove. Rania watched him from her seat by the fire, her sharp eyes tracking his every movement. "People be ready in a bit," he said over his shoulder. "Nothing fancy, but it'll warm you up." Rania didn't respond. Her mistrust lingered, but there was something about this man, his deliberate movements, his calm demeanor that set him apart from the others she had encountered in her life. He didn't demand anything from her, didn't press for answers. Instead, he simply provided. Alira, ever curious, broke the silence. "What soup?" Kyle turned, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's food. Warm food. You'll like it." Rania frowned. "She doesn't eat your food." Kale raised an eyebrow but didn't question her. "Fair enough. If she gets hungry, let me know. I'll see what I can do." Later, as Alira dozed on the hover lounge, wrapped snugly in blankets, Kyle brought Rania a steaming bowl of soup. She eyed it warily before accepting, her hands trembling slightly as she held the bowl. "You don't have to tell me anything," Kyle said, sitting across from her. "Not where you're from, not why you're here. But I figure you've been through a lot. If you need a place to stay, you're welcome here." Rania stared at him, the words catching her off guard. His eyes were steady, his tone sincere. She had heard offers of help before, but they always came with strings attached, expectations, demands, betrayals. Yet this man's demeanor was different. There was no agenda in his gaze, only quiet compassion. For a moment, Rania considered telling him the truth. The crash, her flight from Oryeth, her desperation to protect Alira. But fear held her back. Instead, she nodded curtly. "Thank you." Kale didn't press further. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and rose to stoke the fire. As the eclipse deepened, Rania found herself watching Kale, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her guarded exterior. There was a weight in his movements, a heaviness that spoke of loss. She recognized it had lived it. Whatever this man had endured, it had carved deep lines into his soul, lines she could almost see etched across his face. For the first time since Dren's betrayal, emotion stirred within Rania, a sliver of safety. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something close. And for now, that was enough. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world silent and still. Inside, beneath the warm glow of the fire, two strangers sat quietly, each unknowingly beginning a journey that would change their lives forever. Morning broke slowly over the farm, the pale light of dawn creeping through the mist. Rania awoke with a start, her body instinctively tensing as her mind snapped to awareness. She was still on edge, her instincts honed from solar phases of surviving in a hostile world. The small room was unfamiliar, the warmth from the fireplace a stark contrast to the harsh conditions she and Alira had endured in recent cycles. For a moment she didn't recognize the muted sounds of Nova Terra, the chirping birds, the creak of wooden beams in the eco-dwelling, the distant lowing of cattle. And then she saw Alira. Her daughter was still curled up on the hover lounge, her small body cocooned in a thermal cloak Kyle had provided. Alira's breathing was soft and even, her face relaxed in a way Rania hadn't seen in orbits. It was a sight that simultaneously warmed and shattered Rania's heart. Alira shouldn't have had to endure this life, their life, but here she was, adapting in a way that only children could. The sound of clinking dishes drew Rania's attention to the kitchen. She stiffened, her hand instinctively searching for the jagged metal shard she had kept close during the eclipse. It was still there, tucked into the folds of her makeshift belt. Quietly, she rose, padding toward the sound on silent feet. Kyle stood at the counter, his back to her. The sleeves of his flannel shirt were rolled up, exposing forearms marked with faded scars, remnants of a life that hinted at labor and hardship. He moved with quiet efficiency, cracking eggs into a bowl and stirring them with a fork. The soft hiss of a pan heating on the stove filled the silence. Rania lingered in the doorway, her sharp gaze assessing every detail. The kitchen was small but well kept, its surfaces worn from solar phases of use but clean. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, their earthy scent mixing with the aroma of stim brew brewing on the counter. "You're up early," Cale said without turning, his voice breaking the stillness. He wasn't looking at her, but there was no mistaking the awareness in his tone. "Didn't think I'd hear you over the floorboards." Rania straightened, stepping into the room with measured caution. "I couldn't sleep." Kyle glanced at her over his shoulder, his expression neutral. "I get that. There's stim brew if you want some. Eggs will be ready soon." Rania didn't respond. She crossed her arms, her gaze flicking to the window. The fields outside were blanketed in mist, the rising sun casting a soft glow over the horizon. It was eerily peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of her recent life. Kyle turned back to his work, seeming unbothered by her silence. He cooked with the same quiet competence that had marked his actions the eclipse before, as though used to doing everything alone. The realization pricked at Ranya's curiosity, though she quickly pushed the thought aside. "Her daughter still asleep?" he asked after a moment. "Yes," Rania replied, her tone clipped. She wasn't ready to share more. Kyle didn't press further. He plated the eggs and set them on the table, along with a loaf of fresh bread. "Help yourself," he said simply, pouring a cup of stim brew and sitting down at the table. He didn't eat, just sipped his stim brew and gazed out the window. Ranya's soft footsteps broke the silence. She appeared in the doorway, clutching the thermal cloak around her shoulders. Her wide eyes flicked between Rania and Kyle, hesitant but curious. "Good dawnlight," Kyle said, his voice softer than before. "You hungry?" Alira hesitated, glancing at her mother for permission. Rania gave a small nod, and Alira approached the table, her movements cautious but no longer fearful. Kyle cut a slice of bread and placed it on a plate, pushing it toward her. Alira took it with both hands, her small fingers gripping the edges as though it might disappear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Kyle smiled faintly. "You're welcome." Over the next few days, a tentative routine began to take shape. Kyle provided food and shelter without asking for anything in return, and Rania allowed herself to cautiously lower her defenses, though only slightly. She spent her days helping Alira adjust to their new environment, teaching her the names of Nova Terra's creatures, and marveling at the simple beauty of things they had never encountered before: the vibrant green of grass, the warmth of sunlight unfiltered by the harsh metallic skylines of Nitharian, the way rain felt soft and cool rather than biting and cold. Kiel stayed busy with his work, tending to the fields and repairing the damage from the storm. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, giving Rania and Alira the space they clearly needed, yet his quiet presence was a constant, and Rania found herself observing him more than she cared to admit. There was a weight to Kyle, a heaviness in his movements, a quiet sadness in his eyes that mirrored her own. It wasn't pity, though. It was understanding, the kind that only came from surviving something that left you broken and rebuilding yourself piece by piece. One dusk time, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Rania found herself sitting on the porch steps. Alira was inside, fast asleep after a rotation spent chasing butterflies in the field. The air was cool, the chirping of crickets filling the silence. Kyle joined her, sitting a respectful distance away. He held a mug of stim brew in his hands, the steam curling into the fading light. "You've been quiet," he said after a long pause. Rania glanced at him, her expression guarded. "I don't have much to say." "That's fair," he replied, "but sometimes saying it out loud helps." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The weight of her past pressed heavily on her chest, a burden she had carried alone for so long. But something about Kyle's calm, unassuming presence made her want to let go just a little. "My husband left us," she said finally, her voice flat. "Abandoned us, where I come from. That's worse than death." Kyle didn't interrupt, his eyes steady as he listened. "I had to leave." Rania continued, her tone softening. "Not for me, but for Alira. She deserves better than what our world offered." Kyle nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Sounds like you've done everything you can to protect her." Rania looked at him then, surprised by the lack of judgment in his voice. "I have," she said, her voice firm, "and I'll keep doing it, no matter what." Kyle's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "I believe you." The silence that followed was different, less heavy, more understanding. For the first time since arriving on Nova Terra, Rania felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years' hope. Inside the eco-dwelling, Alira stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. Rania rose to check on her, pausing at the door to glance back at Kyle. He was still sitting on the steps, staring out at the darkening fields. His shoulders were relaxed, his expression peaceful. For the first time, Rania wondered if this quiet farm on a strange, distant world could truly be a home. The days stretched into cycles, and a fragile sense of routine began to settle over the eco-dwelling. Rania found herself slowly easing into this life, though a part of her remained on edge. It was too simple, too peaceful. Life had taught her that such serenity was often fleeting. For Alira, the farm was a wonderland. Each rotation brought new discoveries of fluttering butterfly, the soft bristle of grass beneath her feet, the curious antics of the chickens that Kyle kept in a small coop. Rania watched her daughter thrive in this new world, her laughter ringing out as she dashed across the fields. It was a sound Rania hadn't heard in what felt like solar phases, and it filled her heart with both joy and dread. But Rania couldn't shake the shadow of her past, the scars left by her husband's betrayal and her society's judgment clung to her like a second skin. Even here, in the safety of Kyle's home, she couldn't banish the fear that it could all be ripped away. Kyle, as always, was a quiet presence. He rose before dawn, tending to the farm with practiced efficiency. Rania often joined him, helping in small ways, mending fences, collecting eggs, or simply keeping Alira occupied while he worked. Their conversations were sparse but meaningful, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. Yet even as their bond deepened, Rania remained wary. She caught herself analyzing Kyle's every action, searching for ulterior motives that never seemed to exist. He was kind, without being overbearing, generous without expecting anything in return. It baffled her. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the vegetable garden, Rania finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at her. "Why are you helping us?" Kyle paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at her, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Because you needed help," he said simply. the frown, the answer too straightforward for her liking. People don't just do things out of kindness, not without wanting something in return. Kyle leaned against his shovel, his expression thoughtful. Maybe that's been your experience, he said after a moment. But not everyone's like that. The words struck a chord, but Rania didn't respond. She turned back to her work, her thoughts churning. That eclipse, as the eco-dwelling settled into quiet, Rania sat by the fire, her mind restless. Alira had fallen asleep hours ago, her small body curled up in a nest of blankets. Kael was in his room, the creak of floorboards signaling his movements as he prepared for bed. Rania stared into the flames, their flickering light casting shadows on the walls. She couldn't stay here forever, she told herself. This was temporary, a refuge, not a home. But the thought of leaving filled her with a cold dread. Where would they go? How would she keep Alira safe? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of the floorboards behind her. She turned to see Kael standing in the doorway, his expression cautious but kind. "Can't sleep?" he asked, stepping into the room. Rania shook her head. "Too much on my mind." Kael sat down in the chair across from her, cradling a mug of tea in his hands. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of wind outside. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Kael said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "You and Alira can stay as long as you need." Rania's chest tightened. "And what happens when you change your mind?" she asked, her voice sharp. "When you decide we're too much trouble." Kael's brow furrowed, his gaze steady. "I won't." "How can you be so sure?" she demanded, her voice rising. "People always leave. Always." Kael didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe most people do, but I'm not most people." Rania stared at him, her heart pounding. There was something in his eyes and honesty that unnerved her. It wasn't pity or obligation. It was something deeper, something she wasn't sure she could trust. "I can't lose her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She's all I have." "You won't," Kael said, his voice firm. "Not while you're here." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. For the first time in solar phases, emotion stirred within Rania, the faint stirrings of trust. It was fragile, like a fledgling taking its first steps, but it was there. The following days passed in a blur of activity. Kael taught Rania the rhythms of the farm, how to tend to the animals, when to plant and harvest the crops, the intricacies of maintaining the machinery that kept everything running. Rania found herself enjoying the work, the physical effort grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. Alira, too, thrived in this environment. She followed Kael around like a shadow, her endless questions bringing a rare smile to his face. Rania watched from a distance, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and fear. She wanted to believe this could last, but the fear of losing it was ever present. One dusk time, as they sat together on the porch, Rania finally broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "I can't keep depending on you," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not fair." Kael glanced at her, his expression calm. "You're not a burden, if that's what you're thinking." "But I am," she said, her voice firm. "And I can't live like this, wondering when it's all going to fall apart." Kael was quiet for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "What do you want, Rania?" The question caught her off guard. She turned to him, her brow furrowing. "I want Alira to be safe," I want her to have a future. And what about you? Kyle pressed. What do you want for yourself? Rania hesitated, the question striking a nerve. She had spent so long focusing on Alira's needs that she hadn't allowed herself to consider her own desires. What did she want? Safety, yes. Stability, but more than that. She realized she wanted a place to belong. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Kyle offered a quiet nod, his expression understanding. Well, maybe that's something we can figure out together. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Rania's chest ache. For the first time, she allowed herself to entertain the possibility that this life, this man, could be the beginning of something more. But she also knew that taking that step would require courage she wasn't sure she had. The dawn light was crisp, the air carrying the faint scent of rain from the eclipse before. A thin mist clung to the fields, softening the edges of the horizon. Rania stood on the eco-dwelling porch, watching as the sun broke through the clouds, its golden light spilling across the landscape. In the distance, Alira's laughter rang out as she chased a butterfly through the tall grass. Kyle was nearby, repairing the fence that bordered the field, his steady movements a reassuring constant. For a moment, Rania allowed herself to breathe deeply, the tension in her shoulders easing. It was an unfamiliar feeling piece. It felt fragile, like a glass too thin to hold its shape. But it was there. She wrapped her arms around herself, the weight of the decision she had made the eclipse before still heavy on her mind. The dusk time prior had been a turning point. After cycles of wrestling with her fears, Rania had finally allowed herself to confront them. She had waited until Alira was asleep, her small body tucked under a quilt Kyle had given her. Then with a resolve born from desperation and hope, Rania had approached Kyle. He had been sitting by the fire, a data slate resting in his lap. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of the flames. Rania had stood in the doorway, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "I need to talk to you," she had said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Kyle had looked up, his expression open and calm. "All right." She had stepped into the room, her movements deliberate, and sat down across from him. For a moment she couldn't find the words. They tangled in her throat, threatening to choke her. But she forced herself to speak. "I don't want to leave," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't stay like this certain. Waiting for the rotation, it all falls apart." Kyle had set his data slate aside, leaning forward slightly. "What are you saying?" Rania had taken a deep breath, her gaze locking onto his. "I'm saying I want more than shelter. I want stability, a home, a family." The words had hung in the air between them, heavy with vulnerability. Rania had braced herself for rejection, for disbelief, but what she had seen in Kyle's eyes had startled her. It wasn't pity or hesitation, it was understanding. "You're serious," he had said, his tone quiet but firm. "Yes," she had replied. "I know it's a lot to ask. I know this isn't what you signed up for. But I can't keep living in fear. And Alira, she deserves more than a mother who's always looking over her shoulder." Kyle had been silent for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then he had nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "All right." Rania had blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "All right. I've been thinking about this for a while," he had admitted. "About you. About Alira. He brought something back into this house I thought I'd lost forever." I wasn't sure if I could handle it letting someone in again, but I want to try. His words had broken something in Rania, the wall she had spent solar phases building cracking under the weight of his sincerity. She had looked away, blinking back tears, and nodded. Okay. Now, as she stood on the porch, watching Alira play in the dawnlight light, emotion stirred within Rania, the first stirrings of hope.